Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Awaken Empowered podcast. I'm Micheila Sheldan. I'm here with Ethann Fox, and we get a lot of comments and questions on our various videos and platforms. So we figured we'd do another audience spotlight today where we've assembled some of those questions, comments to address in this episode. So we're going to start with taxation. And in our last podcast, Ethann and I discussed a variety of ways that we unravel ourselves from a corrupt system. And this is directed at you. I combined several questions and comments as one. So Ethann, you mentioned quite often not to pay taxes. I agree with the reasoning. I know several ways in my country. Nevertheless, I find it quite challenging and difficult, even dangerous. The process is so confusing that I don't even know where to begin. Don't pay your taxes and see how fast they take away your house. It doesn't make sense unless you are a sovereign entity like Assetti Ranch. James Gilliland did a huge volume of paperwork correctly to obtain that right from the highest court. Any ideas on where to start with this?
Well, actually it was Winston Shroud who helped James to do that. So all the paperwork that James filed was with Winston's help. And for those of you who've been following us for some time, we had Winston at our expo years ago, and I did some interviews with him in the previous decade. And I had some private conversations with him as well, where I expressed a desire to teach these kinds of things and teach people how to exit the system and not pay their taxes and so on. And Winston's advice to me was that this is not my responsibility in this life, that my role is to do something else, where people like him are here to deal with the actual efforts to do these sorts of things. And he was right, and I took what he said to heart, and realized in the time that's passed since then that my role here is to help people to move to more of a fifth dimensional awareness, because what Winston did with James is certainly one path you can take. And I used to think that was the path that you had to take to get to that place. But my experience over the past decade has made me realize that there are lots of different paths, and it's unique for every person in your situation, the country where you live, and so on. But the actual end result of not paying taxes or not being involved within the system to the same degree is the same for all cases. It's just, for example, let's take the U.S., because I don't know what country you're in, and everyone may be slightly different. In the U.S., and I've done some presentations that are on YouTube still, where I spoke about these subjects, and I played videos from Senate hearings and so on, where the IRS commissioner was asked questions, and where they openly admitted that taxes in the U.S. are voluntary, and that they have to maintain this illusion that they're required, or else people will not pay them. And that tells you everything you need to know right there, is that taxes are voluntary. But see, in the U.S., and I'm sure in many other countries, what's happening is we are unknowingly volunteering. It's just like anytime you plug into the system in any meaningful way, every little thing you do that you plug into the system, whether it's getting a driver's license, whether it's getting a voter registration, whether it is getting a social security number, each one of those things and many others are more incremental steps where you plug into the system. And the more you do, the more you are enslaved by the system. And in the case of taxes, as an example, majority of people get themselves in situations where they unknowingly volunteer legally into the system. So consider that the legal system is a web of restrictions that are created in society, that if someone opts into them, then they are obligated by those restrictions. So, for example, if I get a driver's license, I'm obligated by the restrictions that me opting into that has made possible. In the same way, in the U.S., as an example, when you opt into the tax system, you are volunteering. So, for example, when you fill out a tax return, or even getting a social security number in the first place is one step in that direction. But really the ultimate step is when you fill out a tax return, you are volunteering into the system. You are entering into a legal agreement that where you're agreeing to pay taxes and be honest about it. And if it doesn't matter whether you're honest or not, if the government tax agency, in this case the IRS, determines that you're not honest, doesn't matter whether you really were or not. They have the right to enforce the law which you volunteered into. But if you never volunteered into it in the first place, then you're not obligated by the restrictions. And I think this is where a lot of people don't unknowingly opt themselves into a system, and then they face the repercussions, like what you're saying. They'll come take your home, or they'll take whatever. So now in the US, as an example, there are many ways not to pay your taxes. And I imagine every country that's an option, because the people at the very top of the system in any country, the people who control the system, they don't pay taxes. And they certainly want that option to be there so that they don't have to pay taxes, which means that the system, the structure is there to do that. But you have to figure out how best to do that in your case. For example, if you're in the US and you have a very high net worth, one way to do that and still be, quote unquote, inside the legal system is you could set up a trust. And a lot of billionaires do this, or multimillionaires do this. They put all of their wealth into trusts, including their home, to where they own nothing, legally speaking. And if they own nothing and their income also is in a trust, then they essentially aren't making any income at all. And so they can get away with not paying taxes. Meanwhile, they're the beneficiary of these trusts. And so they can still live in the home. They can still drive the car, even though legally they don't own either one of them. So it depends on your situation, the country you live in, the amount of income you have, the amount of assets you need to protect, if to determine that. Now, if you're an employer in the US, as an example, well, most employers are going to take taxes out anyway, because they feel, or they have also been convinced that they have to follow the legal system, and so they will take taxes out and on your behalf. And so you don't really have a choice in that. And that's why, if you want to, you can't really do it as an employer. You have to be self-employed, although there are ways to refile your taxes to get the IRS to return the money that they took from your taxes from your employer. But that's just a hassle. The best way to do it is to never have paid them in the first place and never opt into the system in the first place, which means that you have to not stop filing tax returns. But again, I'm not suggesting you do that, because I don't know your unique situation and the country you live in, so on. You may have a very complex situation. I know my own, and so I can, see what to do in my case. But also keep in mind that the system always wants you back in there. And although there are many threats of people having lost their homes and their property, I often wonder if that's just propaganda created just to scare people into compliance. The bottom line is, as you move to a fifth dimensional consciousness, you're going to discover that you don't have to participate in these things, whether it be taxes or other things in society that are part of the structure that you don't want to be a part of. So it's really more a factor of consciousness expansion that you come to the realization on your own as to what physical methods or techniques, or nothing at all. And in my case, having gone through all of that and having studied with Winston and all these different methods over the decades, and there are plenty of people out there teaching those things. So if you want to do it inside of the legal system, which people like Winston and other people out there teaching these methods today are teaching you how to opt out of the system from within the system using legal strategies. But I've come to realize that the better way is to not even deal with the legal system, to operate outside of that. And in so doing, but again, you have to take the proper steps to exit that, which I've done little things over the years to achieve. And in your case, it may be something different. So my role here is to help to raise the consciousness of individuals so that you can get to a place where you'll discover that for yourself. And when you do, you may find that it's really inconsequential. and the efforts that you have to make are pretty passive, and that's been the case for me. That's not to say that the various government agencies don't occasionally send me a letter, but I just ignore them and nothing comes of it. And that's another thing you need to keep in mind is the more you try to exit the system, more it tries to pull you back. But the end result is you can pretty much ignore these things and they go away, provided you're doing it in the right way. And but again, I would say study the methods that you are most drawn to. Like in the case of James and Winston, they chose a more legal route. But you don't have to choose the legal route. I live a perfectly comfortable life, and nobody's coming to take away my stuff or anything. And another thing that's really important to keep in mind is if we step back from the legal system itself and we realize that we're all souls here having a journey, and that our divine blueprint has put in motion everything that we're meant to have, then it's not possible for anyone to take anything away that we're meant to have. So if tomorrow somebody comes and takes all my stuff or throws me in jail or whatever happens, it was something that was always going to happen. It was a necessary part of my human journey. And for those people out there who may be experiencing that outcome from what you're saying, those people were always going to have that experience because it was something they were meant to have, perhaps to teach other people, perhaps for other reasons, or their own journey, or even their family members who are part of that journey. But if it isn't meant to be your experience, it's never going to happen. So it's not possible for the government or anyone else to take from me or you or anyone else something that you're meant to have. So from that standpoint, why worry about these things? Because if you're going to lose everything tomorrow, you're going to lose everything tomorrow. It may be the government. It may be somebody breaks into your house and takes everything. It could be that your house burns down. One way or another, you're going to lose everything tomorrow. If that is something that your soul's divine blueprint put in place for you to have an experience. But if that isn't there, then whatever you do isn't going to create that result. Whether you don't pay your taxes or do pay your taxes or whatever path you take, you're still going to end up where you're going to end up. So I would say that's what we need to consider is there's nothing to be afraid of. We chose the journey we came here to have, and it's going to work out how it's supposed to. So from that vantage point, why enslave yourself inside of a system that has no control or power to alter your soul's journey? And that's what I would ultimately say. Now, as far as teaching courses, I don't really see myself teaching courses in the mechanics of how to do this. And again, it would be different for every person, every country. And there are other people out there who are really focused in that area. As Winston told me years ago, that's his focus, and it's not meant to be mine. So you can seek those things out if you feel drawn to one method or another. I may, in the future, focus more on the consciousness aspect and to get people into the right state of being to discover these things for themselves. But the courses themselves would not be my area.
Yeah, I think where Ethann could be really helpful too is from an astrological standpoint, understanding, if you're curious about this and it's something you're motivated to do, it's obviously probably a part of your astrological journey where there's some influence going on in your chart that's drawing you to make these decisions, right? So,
Sure.
so these are things you could probably help with. But the other thing I want to mention is if you scroll back pretty far on the Awaken Empowered Expo channel, Ethann did some great interviews early on with Winston and others on this topic that I think are still very valid today.
Yeah. And astrologically speaking, a person who goes to prison or loses everything, you would see it in their astrology chart at that time.
Yeah.
And you would, for something like if somebody went to prison for an extended period of time, you would see it in their birth chart, meaning this was a journey they were always meant to have. And so it wouldn't have mattered if it was taxes or any number of other things. That person was always going to have this experience. Whereas I know from my chart what I'm here to experience and when situations like that could or may occur. And so I don't really worry about it. But I can keep things in my awareness when certain kinds of challenges or obstacles come up. and so I anticipate those things when they occur. But if everybody on the planet stopped paying their taxes tomorrow, everybody's not going to end up in jail, obviously, right? And that's the thing we need to understand is those people who are meant to have that experience because their soul wanted to evolve through it will have it, and the rest of us will not have it because we're not all meant to have that journey. So why fear things when it may not be part of your journey? So consulting an astrologer may be one way to alleviate some of that concern, but even if an astrologer told you, "Oh, you're somebody who's has a potential of ending up in jail and losing all your stuff," well, that doesn't change anything. The fact that you now know it doesn't change the fact that you're still going to have that journey, and it doesn't matter how you end up having it; it's still going to occur. So again, no one can take from you what is yours and what is meant to be yours, and it doesn't matter whether it's the government or someone else.
All right, next question. How do you find out who the teacher, guide, or source of channeled guidance is that leads you in the creation of music or automatic writing? I can give some insight here just based on my own personal experience, and I think this is different for everyone. When I first started to channel, I had no idea, first of all, that I was channeling or what channeling was, but I was also hearing multiple voices that I kind of felt and knew were coming from different beings or guides and different dimensions. And it was constant to the point where it was almost driving me insane. And I did not really want this path. So at the time I was pretty angry. But I just sat down one day and in a very telepathic and astral sense, told the beings who were speaking to me that they could not speak through me or work through me unless they gave me their name first. And from that point on, I started getting a name immediately and knowing exactly who they were. But I think for some people, and this is what I've noticed in my private sessions, is it comes into the physical plane first. So if you're channeling something, whether it's music, automatic writing, or your voice channeling, there are always mirror reflections, I believe, that show up synchronistically in our lives. We might all of a sudden start pulling the Archangel Michael card, or we go to YouTube and immediately the Pleiadians keep showing up over and over and over again. You know, these are things I think that are obvious and, you know, concrete validations of the guidance and insight that we get. And we have to believe in those things. And that is what the guides always say is we've lost faith in ourselves. So, you know, a lot of us have been betrayed. We've been through trauma. We've been trained in not trusting ourselves and looking outside to another source. So I think that has to be rectified first, because unless we can truly believe in what our hunches are and what our intuition is about who we're channeling, we're never going to get that validation in the physical. I think the two work very symbiotically together as one. So the synchronicity comes when we validate and believe in ourselves and we stop going outside of ourselves to others, because I do get people in session who are channels who have gone to multiple other channels who've said, you know, you're channeling this or that or the other thing, and it's all in conflict. So I think it's really important to silence yourself, ask the question, or really just create an intention, have a conversation with your guides, and they will hear everything that you say, whether it's verbally or whether it's done telepathically, that you just really want to know exactly who they are and to show that to you in the best form possible. You know, for me, that's hearing. So it was easy for me to say, tell me your name. You know, for others, maybe it's through automatic writing, or you're going to start hearing music on the radio with words that validate these various intuitive, you know, hunches and things that you get.
Yeah, I have nothing to add to that.
Okay. All right. This one's for you, Ethan. I live in California and cannot purchase incandescent light bulbs. I had the idea that I would purchase them online, but couldn't complete the transaction because the bulbs cannot be shipped to California. I then decided to investigate purchasing the bulbs online, sending them to an out-of-state forwarding service and paying to have them sent back to me. Well, looking into the forwarding the bulbs, while looking into forwarding the bulbs, I discovered that as of August 1st, 2023, incandescent light bulbs will be banned in the US. What can we do now?
Well, now I don't, it's obviously after August now, so as we're filming this, and I can tell you that, and I don't know what it's like in California, we're in Michigan, but I can tell you that the ban is not across the board on all incandescent bulbs. It's on most of the incandescent bulbs, at least the most popular ones, the standard bulbs. But specialty bulbs can still be purchased that are incandescent, and even some more popular incandescent bulbs are even still available. For example, if you were to go on Amazon or any online retailer, you should be able to find a lot of incandescent bulbs still available. But the most popular ones, the most used ones, are the ones that are banned. So I can still buy incandescent bulbs today. But just to be safe, I did, because I happen to like having incandescent bulbs and in specific use cases, I purchased several years' worth of supply worth on my own, because all these bans are going to eventually be reversed. But we may have to ride out a period of time where we have to live with it. And because a lot of these things are being done for ESG standards, I don't know if any of you are familiar with that, but environmental social governance standards, which are being pushed forth by the World Economic Forum and hedge funds like BlackRock, for example, who own the majority of large companies in the world today, are pushing these agendas forward. So this is not based on market forces, meaning supply and demand. It's really based on ideologies that are being pushed forth into society today. And I think these ideologies will collapse in the next decade for sure, but in the 2020s, it may continue to be in place. So I would suggest that you find a way to get those if you want incandescent still. Maybe you have to make connections with a friend online or somebody who can purchase for you in another state and ship them to you, because I do see a fair amount of incandescent is still available. Some are not, but you should still be able to get them in whatever it is that you want. Just maybe not exactly what you were buying before, although I can't say for sure California and what they have banned, but I do know in Michigan, although it is banned now, we can still get some of them. So I would suggest doing that, and then just stocking up for however many you think you need for this decade. And at some point, we're going to see other options coming available, or other sources where we can purchase them. It's just like, last few years, as I've mentioned in previous shows, N-acetylcysteine was banned in the U.S. during the whole virus time period. And of course, now it's no longer banned. And we're going to see those kind of things occur. There are going to be a lot of bans based on agendas that our governments and various financial institutions have. But those bans will also be dissolved at some point, and those things will be made available to us again. It's hard to say at this point how long that will be. Just like electric cars and gas-powered cars, they're planning on banning gas cars by 2050. I don't think that's going to happen, because I think realistically, all of these bans, or the proposed bans on electric or on gas-powered cars, are philosophical in nature. There are certain agendas put forth by governments and institutions, but the reality is it won't be possible to fulfill those bans when the time comes, and so eventually things will reverse. And I think just like we see a lot of conventional automotive companies like General Motors that are going through major restructuring and losing money because they're starting to self-sabotage as a result of ESG standards to get rid of gas-powered cars. We're going to see in the 2030s that gas-powered cars are going to make a big comeback, because the push to accelerate the adoption of electric, which is not really for sustainable energy goals as much as it is for control, that will fail by the 2030s, and gas-powered cars will have to come back. So That's what I would suggest is you may have to find somebody else out of state who can still purchase for you what you need and just stock up what you need for a little while so you can ride out the period of the bans until market forces take over again and things become available because people want them.
In our last podcast entitled Conscious Action, you and I made the remark that we are all responsible for what happened in Maui and, of course, other events around the world. And there were a few people who had comments and questions about that, namely, how do repeating events from history actually contribute to things that are happening now? And how would we have paid for what happened in Maui?
Well, I mean, you can go ahead. I just answered the last one.
Okay. Well, if we take this to the highest level, obviously we all know that the collective reality and what we manifest here on the earth as human beings is all tied to each one of us individually. So beyond some of the 3D considerations in terms of how we are contributing financially and otherwise, if we take this up to the highest level, we know we are all contributing to what manifests collectively. But the guides talk about the spiral of time quite a bit in my channel transmissions. They always say we are not creating from nothingness. Everything that was before comes back around again in a slightly different fashion. And we are meant to upgrade that somehow, to influence it through our personal desires and to transmute it or somehow modify it into something new. And we are all doing this every single day in our human personal experiences. I'm sure you can even see that in the astrology, both from a collective and a personal standpoint. We repeat patterns mainly because we haven't raised in consciousness enough to somehow bring them into a higher dimension. So right now, and what we brought into the channeled revelations shows, is that we are repeating the Great Flood period. And we can pretty much see that. And you have been following what's going on in Beijing, and now we have in Nevada at Burning Man. Flooding is kind of the theme here. Weather events, right? Modifying weather, tampering with genetics. All of that stuff is from ancient history that we as human beings have not yet risen above. So it comes back around and it repeats in a slightly different fashion. And so that's the historic piece. However, our consciousness is going to dictate how those things repeat. And we are also creators. So we are inputting into this spiral of time or into the grid system how these things tend to play out. And the good news is, and we talked about this, I think, in one of the past podcasts, is that we have raised in consciousness enough to the point where the guides say a cataclysmic event like the Great Flood isn't really in our potentials right now. Not that it couldn't be. I think we are creators in each moment. So how we handle what is happening on the planet right now can shift the timeline that we are on very quickly and very easily. But for now, what the guides are saying is our consciousness is raised to such a level that we're literally breaking these large, more catastrophic events into smaller, more digestible events that we're able to easier influence, even though they seem impossible and really hard for us as individuals to tackle, right? But that's what we're seeing play out on the planet. From a 3D material financial standpoint, what we were reiterating in the podcast is that our taxes, our tax dollars are paying for all of these things that are happening that are modifying the weather, right? The satellites that they are using, all of these things we are paying for out of our hard-earned weekly paycheck. And that's the important connection that we believe needs to be made on the ground level for us to untangle ourselves in very literal and physical ways from contributing even more. Because, as you said, I think you said it perfectly in the last podcast, there's only a small number of people at the top who are orchestrating these events, and they need us. They need us to agree. They need us to fund. And they need us to be complicit to all of the things that they are orchestrating on our behalf and on the earth and, humans, plants, animals, all of these things. So if you have something to add to that, maybe you can.
I don't know much to add. You pretty
clarify.
much said it.
Yeah.
But only thing, when we pay taxes, we finance the government to reallocate those taxes. As I've said in previous podcasts, the government produces nothing on its own. The government takes from the people and reallocates those resources. And the vast majority of that reallocation is into military contracts. Tesla, SpaceX, as an example, they're military contractors. Sure, they may also produce nice electric cars, but the vast majority of money they make is from government contracts for military projects. So the satellites they launch into space, for example, the largest military contractor that specializes in directed energy weapons happens to be in Maui, actually. It's not a coincidence, right? So who paid for that government contractor? Well, all of those of us who pay taxes paid for that. Even though we didn't tell our government we wanted them to use directed energy weapons on Maui. But nonetheless, if you're paying taxes, you're financing these things. If you're paying taxes, you're also paying for the war in Ukraine. Maybe you didn't agree with it, but those billions of dollars that they're sending over there didn't come from nowhere. They came from our taxes, and they also came from inflation. That's another thing to keep in mind is when the government issues currency into the financial system, they access currency every time they do that. It's coming from the value that you have sitting in your own assets. So if you have money in the bank, for example, they're extracting value from the money you have in the bank in order to be able to print that extra currency. So keep in mind that participating in the financial system and not taking your money outside of the system to some degree, you're also financing in that way as well, which is another topic, which I think there's another question on the list that I can go into a little bit more depth. But essentially, to answer the question, is if you're paying taxes, if you're paying into the system in any way, you are financing all of these things that you don't want.
I have long been a huge believer in the power of the individual to affect collective change. I also had the idea decades ago that one action consumers should take is to stop buying from big corporations. I felt saddened, however, by the reality. For consumers to interrupt a company like Amazon's profits, it would require so many of us to pull accounts. And I don't see evidence that people really care enough to give up their convenience. This podcast reminded me to keep making these choices and supporting companies that match my values.
Well, I think, first of all, let's clear up what we were saying last time, because I think we were making some general statements, and it's not always possible for us to say everything we're meaning to say when we say things. First of all, I think we have a tendency to want to make these individual decisions about a particular corporation when the reality is that all these companies are owned by the same people. So, for example, I know a lot of people don't like using PayPal, and so they boycott PayPal, but they still use MasterCard and Visa. But it doesn't really matter. It's the same financial institution, and the same global hedge funds and wealth management firms own all the same companies. So even if you stop buying from Amazon, well, it doesn't really change anything. Because, yeah, you may affect Amazon, but the people who are pulling the strings in the entire global financial system and large corporations are all the same people. So that it doesn't really hurt them in the way that you think. So if you choose PayPal but still use MasterCard and Visa, you haven't changed anything. Or vice versa. Or if you stop buying from Amazon but then you buy from Best Buy instead, it doesn't really change anything. So that's not really what we're saying. But on the other hand, though, if you want to have a simpler life and go out, live in the woods or live in nature, then you don't need those things. So for whatever your life is meant to experience and express, you can participate in the system to the degree that makes sense. Now, in our case, a lot of the electronics in this room, it wouldn't have been possible for us to do this show if I didn't buy from larger corporations. I can't go to the guy on the street corner and buy high-end electronics from them. That's just not something I can do. So regardless of who I buy from, there's going to be some connection to someone who I don't want to support in the financial system. Even the manufacturers of these companies, these corporations are all owned by institutions like BlackRock, for example, who are the majority shareholders. So either way, if I want to buy a camera and electronic equipment to do this show, I'm going to have to support BlackRock, which is an institution that I wouldn't want to support, and any number of other corporations that contributed all the parts that go into the electronics that make this possible. So I can either choose to not do it at all and decide, well, we're just not going to do any more shows because I don't want to buy from these companies and support these intentions of these world leaders. Or we can decide that in doing this show, we're doing something that's more beneficial to the world in a way that's in alignment with our soul's journey, even though we may have to buy from these institutions that we don't want to support. So what we're saying is there are areas where we can make meaningful choices. For example, I watch a lot of YouTube videos and read a lot of books, so I'm familiar with many things going on in the world, not only in this spiritual and ancient, civilization space, but also in the entertainment industry and so on. And one trend that I've noticed the last few years is a lot of mainstream films are failing because they put so many woke ideologies and programming into the shows in the recent years that people are starting to reject them because more and more people are becoming conscious of these agendas to program them and their children to having certain belief systems that are not beneficial to a happy, fulfilling life. And so a lot of these films, for example, the Disney Corporation, Disney, as an example, is getting to the point where they may have to sell off their company because they continue to produce these films that people are rejecting. And this is where, we can make choices that actually matter, that really don't impact our life purpose or mission, or things that may bring us joy in our lives. Meanwhile, companies like Disney will learn by failing and going broke, and as a result having to sell off their company to other individuals or institutions who will hopefully make better choices in order to be successful. The problem in the world today, there's another philosophy that's being thrown around these days that capitalism is evil, but the reality is we don't live, in the US in particular, in a capitalistic society anymore. We live in more of an oligarchy than a capitalist society, because in a capitalist society, a company is allowed to fail if it makes poor choices. So a company like Disney, or even many of the banks, for example, if the bank makes poor investments in a capitalist society, it would be allowed to fail, whereas in the system we have today is more of a corporatocracy where you have the government bailing out the companies and institutions that they want to keep going. Meanwhile, the rest of us, if we fail, we're allowed to fail. And that's what the problem is in our society today. Is it's not capitalistic. If it was capitalism, then incandescent bulbs would still be available because people still want them. But in a system where the government dictates how business and the economy operates, whereas not the market doesn't dictate those things. You have things like bans on N-acetylcysteine, or you have bans on incandescent light bulbs, or you have the support of banks that are failing because they made poor choices. And that's what I'm saying is there are areas we can make decisions, and in so doing, these corporations will change and will make different choices. And one of those may be not paying your taxes, and one of those may be not supporting, which nowadays, if you don't want to support woke ideologies, then, well, you really can't watch much of anything that's on Netflix or coming out of Hollywood these days, because almost everything has so much programming, psychological conditioning in there that you can't really watch much of anything. But those are areas where you can make choices. the optional things in our lives that are not really contributing to our advancement on our soul's journey or our happiness or even the betterment of society is really what we're talking about. And practically speaking, you may not be able to do that for everything. If you're living in a Western society, you may have to buy from Amazon. Or if you're not buying from Amazon, you may buy from Best Buy or some other big box retailer because, well, you can't buy some things from just everyday people. But there are other choices you can make. For example, well, we don't have to buy our avocados from a grocery store. We can buy it from a farmer. Or we can buy other products direct from the farmer. So make small choices like that to slowly move in a direction. But until society changes in a dramatic way, you may still have to buy from certain large corporations. But I think if more and more of us start making those small decisions in areas that don't really impact our lives in any significant way, we will eventually, as a collective, move society in a direction where the companies that are doing things that are not beneficial to the planet and humanity will be discouraged from doing them because they will fail. And as a result, we will start seeing them changing their direction and producing things that are more beneficial. So it's not something that we can solve by boycotting Amazon. It is something that we can solve by making small decisions that lead to better fulfilling lives and spending money toward things that we can benefit society with.
I think it's a good point to always consider your intention behind every decision, especially in the circumstances we find ourselves in today where, Ethan was talking about the intention behind our Amazon purchases was to create this studio to further our work and better the world. And sometimes we're choosing between bad and worse, and we really have to hone in on what's the intention, what is the end goal or the outcome. And, during the pandemic, this was a big thing, and we're going into winter again. So we know we're going to be dealing with some of those bad to worse decisions. And, there were periods of time here in Michigan where we were expected to stand in a line outside of the grocery store in the cold where they only let in a few people at a time. And you had to wear a mask and have your temperature checked, and you had to follow little arrows down each aisle and stand behind plexiglass. And we just were not, we decided we were not going to do that. So the good thing that came out of it was we did find small farms and, things that we order regularly that we got straight from the source. But you can't do all of that at once. So there was definitely some more Amazon purchases during that time. And, for me, that was freedom. It was not stepping into situations that I was going to either have to fight my way in the door or have to succumb to something that I did not agree with. And I think that's, it's just the coincidence that we have right now in a transitioning world where we're awakening to all of these evil things, is that we really have to pick and choose and use our energy wisely. And sometimes that doesn't make the perfect end result that we want, but we're getting there, right? With every small choice, we're getting there.
Right. And, speaking to masks and vaccines, that was an easy decision for me.
Mm-hmm.
Wearing masks or getting vaccinated was not going to contribute to my life in any positive way, nor the world. So I chose not to do either. And so I never wore a mask at all in all the last few years. And I didn't participate in the vaccination program. So these are two areas that were a very simple decision that I could make. I didn't need to participate in that. And so I think there are certain areas we can all make those choices. And even though they may seem inconsequential, they add up over time. And imagine if enough people, we're about to go into another situation like that right now, where over this fall, winter, they're preparing all of us to go through another vaccine masking period. You're starting to see various schools requiring masks again, and they're starting to push the narrative of the next virus that's coming out. And the question is, how many people are going to support those things? Because, granted, the government's paying for the vaccines from everybody's taxes, so it doesn't, or by inflation. So either way, those of us who are paying taxes are financing the vaccines anyway. But if hardly anybody participates in that program, and if hardly anybody wears a mask in this next fall, winter we're about to go into, then that agenda is not going to be pushed forward. Now, they'll probably push forward something even worse, because the more we don't participate in this decade, the more they're going to roll out to try to force people to participate. But the question is, at what point do people just start doing their own thing and realize that these programs are not for our benefit? These are areas where we can easily make choices because, well, there's no reason to do those things. They contribute nothing to society. They contribute nothing to us. If anything, they may harm us. So these are areas where you should be looking to make some choices that are more conscious and that are easier decisions to make than where you buy your groceries. And, well, you can't buy it from a big box store because they're evil, but you've got to buy them from somewhere. But you could buy them from a farmer, maybe. Camera equipment, you can't do that. So that's what we're really speaking about.
Yeah, I mean, my hope is at the business level that a lot of that pushback takes place, because what we really want is to participate more with small businesses. And I think that in the last phase of the pandemic, the small businesses felt they got pushed the hardest because people didn't want to come in and buy things, but they also had to comply with all of these rules, which pushed a lot of people like us out the door. Now, for me, I was seeing a doctor at the time, and there was no way I was going to comply with all of the crazy stuff that the doctors were requiring. But I ended up finding a practitioner who open door policy, no signs, no mask, no nothing, right? Small business. And it was perfect for me. And I think that if that's going to happen in this next phase, then that would be the biggest turnaround in all of this, for us to be able to support small businesses who are saying no, because we know the big box stores, they're all going to comply, right? And we want that anyway. So on the topic of justice, and we hit this one pretty hard in our last podcast, someone posted, I believe the elite should have to pay tons for what they have done to people. You can't put a price on human lives. If a group found a lawyer like Erin Brockovich pro bono, then they should go for it. We need more good lawyers who don't want money, but justice for really exceptional and extremely difficult cases when we need to slap the hand of the government. So, I mean, I don't want to restate all the stuff that we stated last time, but I want to add some more context to this, because I think the problem that people have getting past this idea of justice and the government is that the government is never going to be brought to justice. And we're just going to waste a lot of energy trying to make this happen, because the judicial system was created to keep those at the top free and rich, and those who are receiving all of the downfall from them on the opposite spectrum. And, you know, when we see these big cases like Erin Brockovich, for example, we have to consider that they may want to allow us to have a few wins. And I know that sounds like a really defeating insight, but I really believe and feel it's true, because we can look right now, for example, if you're on Netflix, the Sacklers and the OxyContin. That's a big, drama that's out right now that's coming back. And to me, I think it's perfect timing. People who are really upset with the pharmaceutical companies can watch a show like that and, slam their fist on the table and say, justice happened. But did it really? Because, they didn't really end up paying very much at all. They're still a very rich family. And we have pharmaceutical companies doing the exact same thing. And in terms of the Erin Brockovich situation, the biggest polluter of this world is our federal government. And I think people don't realize, unless you've gone down the rabbit hole of geoengineering, which has been going on since the early 70s. The government's been spraying all kinds of toxins in our air. They've been polluting our soils with glyphosate, our groundwater. And nothing ever happens to them other than they get more money to actually do it more. So I actually have a little past history with this, which might surprise people. prior to my channeling debut. I was a stay-at-home mom, but before that, I actually worked in the environmental industry. And right out of college, I took a marketing position at an environmental company. And at the time, it was brand new. This was in the 90s. And I really think some of the original, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act stuff that came out in the 70s. And there wasn't a lot of hammer put down, on industry. And by the time I got there, industry was actually having a hard time dealing with some of what the legacy before them had left behind. And I was actually OSHA trained, certified to go into steel plants and foundries and even military bases and Superfund sites and things like that. And I toured a great many. And what I found is there were really good human beings in unfortunate positions where for years and years, there were no standards, no regulations for dumping hazardous waste. And the protocol was just that you put it in the earth. You dug a pit and you covered it up. And now we know better. But what happened was the government put so many fines on these companies that they wanted to do the right thing. Environmental remediation is really expensive. I mean, it's horrendously expensive. But they did not have the money to actually clean it up. So this is another situation where what I observed was the government was making a lot of money with the farce or the idea that they were doing the right thing by putting all of these laws in place, which actually brought them more money through fines, but they weren't really helping the situation. Even in government contracts, which I was in for a number of years and actually won a very big award of a Superfund site that I worked on for a couple of years, doing hazardous waste manifests. The government has no intention of cleaning up the earth. These Superfund sites are just money pits. They make money for the contractors that they choose, that are government appointed, that are in the clique. And the little guys who come in and get these awards are beaten down. I was working for a company that almost went out of business because we were trying to do the right thing on a government site where we wanted to clean things up, but we're on a hamster wheel of trying to appease a government contractor who just kept sending us in circles, right? So I think the illusion is that the right thing will happen through the justice system. But as I mentioned, and I'm not going to beat a dead horse, the justice system is a part of a very corrupt government that has been created for its own benefit. So any effort that we put in there is really just taking away precious and valuable currency that we have to do the things outside of the system that are actually going to make, I think, the biggest benefit. So I think human beings, whether they live, living in these roles of, environmental managers in big steel plants, or, they're heading up a corporation that is trying to create something through an industrial process. I think a lot of them really want to do the right thing, but unfortunately they are stuck in a system that makes it really hard for them to do the right thing, which is why we have so many of the problems that we have today. So I was fortunate enough to be a member of a variety of different, like the Foundry Society, the Chamber of Commerce, the environmental committees, where I learned the ins and outs of the laws and the regulations that were put in place for industry. And they were not helpful whatsoever.
I think you covered it. So let's just move on to the next question.
Okay, well, here's one for you, and it's several questions combined. Can Ethann please elaborate more on CBDCs? Would all of our existing cash be converted over to CBDCs? And if so, how would we not participate besides only using cash, which is becoming more and more difficult to use by the day? I just Googled to see what's online about CBDCs. And all of the articles that said they're being launched in July seem to have been taken down. In fact, there's just a handful of references to CBDCs at all. My sources say they can't pull it off with a system that would have to handle millions or billions of transactions a day.
Well, that I think is a misconception, because the number of transactions per day is not a problem. We already have a financial infrastructure that can do that. I mean, even Visa and MasterCard can already process enough transactions for everyone's needs at this moment. So I don't think the number of transactions per day is an obstacle. A lot of this is theory, though, because even though the plans to bring out a CBDC seem pretty obvious, and it's definitely going to happen. I don't know where you're seeing that it was going to happen in July. The payment rails were pushed out in July. So yes, the CBDC is already here, but it's not here on the retail level. Retail meaning regular people using it. It is here on the infrastructure level of the banks and such. So banks are now using a CBDC, but regular people don't have it yet. At what point they're going to roll that out is hard to say, but I would say in the next couple to few years, we should see that. And we're already seeing little signs of a social credit-based system, because in the recent few years, governments have locked the bank accounts of people who say things that they don't want people to be saying. So we've already seen that even in Canada or even in the US, people's bank accounts being shut down or not being allowed to use the banking system if they speak out against it or speak out against anything that the government doesn't want you to say. So you're seeing the early signs of a social credit-based banking system coming into place. But you can't do it on a mass scale without a central bank digital currency, because at present, if people can transact at will without having the government be able to say anything about it, then you can't control the people, what the people say, what the people think, and what the people do. But with the CBDC, it can be done automatically using artificial intelligence and social credit. So I don't think the technology is an obstacle. The technology will be possible. The question is adoption. At the end of the day, it's not about the technical aspects of it as to whether or not this is going to happen. It's really going to matter the adoption. So, as any of you who are following what's happening in the financial space these days, governments and world financial institutions are trying very hard to remove all of the alternative currencies that people could switch to, because you can't have a CBDC if people can buy Bitcoin or if they can buy gold and silver, because you have to. The part of the reason to have the CBDC is the government wants to, the government wants to go into more debt by having the Federal Reserve in the U.S., for example, issue more currency into the financial system. So if the Federal Reserve issues more currency and gives it to the government to spend on wars and Maui fires and whatever else, well, somebody has to pay for that issuance of that extra currency, and who pays for it is those of us who have money in US dollars sitting in a bank account. And if those of us who have that start moving that into alternative currencies such as crypto or gold, for example, then the government cannot inflate the dollar, which means they can't issue as much currency to do all these nefarious things. So a CBDC is absolutely necessary for them to continue the agendas that they've been doing. And as a result, we're starting to see new laws and regulations going into place that are eliminating these off-ramps for US dollars, as one example, meaning they're starting to close or down or to prevent people from buying gold. So a lot of the gold bullion dealers are being put out of business, and various crypto institutions are having more regulations put into place preventing people from being able to as easily purchase cryptocurrency. Because if everybody took their US dollars that they have sitting in the bank and moved them into other currencies, the government would be stopped in their tracks. They would no longer be able to finance their spending on all of these things that we don't like. So a CBDC is coming. There's no question about that, because it has to, for them to continue on their agendas. Question is, how many people are going to adopt it and go along with it? To some degree, we may have to. There may be certain things that you participate in society that requires you to pay with a CBDC. So you may, in some degree, have to. But the question is, beyond that, to what degree do people participate? That ultimately is going to be the factor that determines whether it succeeds or not. It's too early to say, because they're certainly going to twist everybody's arm to make them use it as much as possible. But in other countries like Africa, as an example, their CBDC has failed, is failing, because people who are using it are only using it for very small amount of their needs. The vast majority of their spending is still done in other currencies. But it doesn't really matter if you have dollars in cash in your hands and paper dollars, if you have dollars sitting in the bank account. If the government goes into more debt and the Federal Reserve issues more currency into the financial system, those dollars in your hands as paper form or sitting in the bank are still losing value due to inflation. So it makes no difference. Your dollars are worth less and less and less, and will continue. This decade, we'll see an enormous amount of inflation in the US and worldwide, because these various agendas have to be financed somehow. So I don't think the technical issues you're talking about are a reality, in the sense that I don't think transaction volume is going to be an obstacle. I think the only obstacle at the end of the day is us and our choice to go along with these things or not. Just like our choice to wear masks and get vaccinated or not, ultimately are going to determine whether those agendas are successful.
We might as well put this question in too, is right along the same topic. I hear much more positive things about gold and silver than Bitcoin, plus more people trust it. Bitcoin seems to be more and more difficult to purchase now, with extremely intrusive third-party platforms being put in place that you need to use to acquire it.
You are right in that there are more regulations coming down the line for cryptocurrencies, but nothing has changed. You can easily buy cryptocurrency. If today you're not doing it, by tomorrow you could be. It's not that complicated. Even using the Cash App on your phone that most people have, you can buy Bitcoin right on the Cash App. There's no extra step involved, no extra regulation. Now, over the last few years, of course, a lot of government regulations have been put in place to have various identity verification, which did not exist prior to that. But you're going to see the same thing happening for gold and silver as well very soon. In fact, a lot of bullion dealers, as I mentioned earlier, are starting to be blocked because they have to. If people, as inflation accelerates in this decade, if people start moving their US dollars into gold and silver or Bitcoin, that's going to prevent the government from inflating the dollar and spending the amount of money that they want to spend. That's not going to be allowed. So you're going to see the same restrictions being put in place on precious metals as you will in crypto, because any way for people to escape the dollar into alternative currencies that cannot be inflated away is going to be prevented. And in my opinion, right now, crypto, or rather not all cryptocurrencies, but let's take Bitcoin as an example, is in some respects easier and better than gold and silver, because more and more gold and silver is being faked by various Chinese manufacturers and so on. So how do you know? Unless you go to a reputable gold and silver dealer who can verify the authenticity, it's a bit of a risk to buy gold and silver, because you could be getting something that's fake that you won't realize is fake until you go to turn back in at some point. And there's also the factor of convenience. If we go into a system in the years ahead and you need to where you your dollars are worth very little, and now you've got gold and silver coins or bars. It's not easy to buy something online with a gold coin. You're going to have to ship it there, and you have to have physical storage for it. Cryptocurrencies can be easily transacted electronically. So an argument can be made for both. I don't think either one is better or worse. It's just a preference. And plus, gold and silver, although Bitcoin is certainly now becoming more so manipulated by large institutions, gold and silver are definitely manipulated by large institutions. The banking sector, as an example, they heavily manipulate the value of gold and silver. Otherwise, gold and silver are probably worth a lot more than it is. So there are certainly advantages and disadvantages both ways. So I don't think you can make a generalization like that gold and silver are better and cryptocurrencies are not. There are certain advantages to both. And in my opinion, Bitcoin is better in many respects in the world we're going into than gold or silver because electronic exchange is easier. And unless you're going to buy something from a local store where you can hand them the gold and silver, and even then, do you know that your local grocery store is going to accept it? Maybe they will. If we move to a CBDC-based system, for example, is the local grocery store going to accept a gold coin? We don't know yet. More likely they'll be able to accept cryptocurrency, but even that may be blocked by the governments who are trying to prevent us from having on and off ramps for alternative currencies. So it's hard to make these judgments in a world where we don't know what the world leaders are going to try. But I think that anything, we don't have to be dogmatic one way or the other. Anything that is an alternative currency that will perform well in an inflationary environment is a good idea to start thinking about moving more of your wealth and assets into, because a time will probably come in the not too distant future where we may not be able to do that anymore, where it'll be extremely difficult to take our value out of dollars into something else. And even if in the short run we may not be able to spend it, we at least will be able to maintain that value outside of the current financial system and be able to use it when those restrictions lift. And they will lift. May not lift this decade, but I do believe that they will lift as Pluto goes further into Aquarius. So in the 2030s and beyond, I think those freedoms will be restored. But this decade is a period of time that we really need to navigate, and I think the sooner we move more of our value into alternative currencies, the less we enable our governments to inflate the dollar and spend all this money toward nefarious ends.
I started noticing a few years ago that when I go to other people's houses or spend time with clients who are very third dimensional, time becomes incredibly slow. But when I spend time with friends and family who are in the same understanding and mental space as I am, time goes by incredibly fast. This is just one observation I've experienced while venturing in and out of the different realities. And when I spend time alone at home, my entire day goes by in what feels like a couple of hours. The concept of time is still hard for me to wrap my head around. I can provide some insight on time and really simplify the concept, because the guides spend a lot of time in the book talking about time, which is really just our focused energy. So time is equal to where we focus our energy and attention. But unfortunately, in the third dimension, because our sovereignty has been somewhat suppressed, linear time came into being, and we needed this structure of linear time, because our time is our focused energy and precious time is hijacked by something or someone else. So for example, you go to an 8 to 5 job and we have to clock in and clock out, or school starts at 7 and the kids let out at 3:30, right? All of these things, we get paid by an hourly rate. These things are very limited ways of being in a multi-dimensional reality. And the guys even bring in the example, if you can remember back in school, there were certain topics that you loved. Like for me, I loved art. Art class. I lived for art class. So even though art class was an hour, the same as math class was an hour, that art class went by so fast because my focused energy and attention were so immersed in things that I loved that I wasn't really tracking the time. In fact, I probably never thought to even look at the clock, where I would dread going to math class, and every few minutes was checking the clock to see when it was over with. And that's just showing us where our gifts, abilities, preferences lie. So in a fifth dimensional reality, what we're actually doing is we're reclaiming our precious time and our focused attention. And I can tell you, from going from one reality to another, it's such a difference in terms of lifestyle, because right now, as a channel, which is what I do as a mission for a quote unquote living, I don't, even though I keep a schedule, so I have clients, I have interviews, I have filming for this podcast and things that I have on the calendar, there's nothing outside of me that's dictating my time. I am the one who is deciding where I'm going to focus my energy, attention, and how much of that needs to actually be expressed. And that is a different way of being in the world. And I talk a lot in these podcasts about the third dimension and what the guides say about it sort of collapsing onto itself, because there's more and more restrictions. And those restrictions are focused on our time. So if we have to follow all of these regimented policies about masking and temperature checks and waiting in line and all that takes up our precious currency and our time. I can remember when I was little, for example, we didn't really have all the extracurriculars that kids have today. We went home, we got off the bus, and it was free time. It was playtime. And the guys even use the example that we played until the streetlights came on. So there was no iPhone. We weren't paying attention to the time. My mom called me home for dinner and I was a block over on my bike and heard her call, or I just knew the streetlights came on. It was time to go in. So time wasn't really a consideration. But, even I've noticed as a mother, if I could go back, I would probably have done it differently. But the restrictions on kids and schooling and extracurriculars, it just keeps them and the parents and the entire family in this vicious loop of driving and picking up and homework and requirements and rushing through dinner and all of these things. So really, I think the third to the fifth dimension, it's kind of like our time is not our own in the third dimension. And I think that's why it feels like things last so long. Because when we use the example, we go back to family and we make small talk, but it's hard. It's hard to make that small talk. It feels like we're there for a really long time and we're ready to go, because our creative energy and our interests and who we are, it's really not being freely expressed. And when it is, time doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if we were there 3 hours or 5 hours. It's just really something that we're choosing and that we love to do. So I think in every dimension, time is measured differently. And as we go up in through dimensions, time kind of ceases to exist, not because it's not real, but because we don't have the need to measure it in the same ways that we did before. So even when it comes to prosperity, charging money for something, and we've addressed this in past podcasts where there's hourly rate and, there's competition and we have to look at what everyone else is charging and somehow place ourselves in there. But what I notice about myself and in the fifth dimension is we're really looking at what is my focused energy. Even if I'm spending an hour doing a client, what is the energetic output and what is the value of that? So beyond time, we're really focusing on value being an aspect of our energy or energetic contribution versus the expectations and limitations of the third dimension.
You covered that really well. I have nothing else to add to that.
Okay. I would like to ask a question that I'm trying to work through. It pertains to the part of the conversation on spiritual people saying one thing, like we are all one, and no one is higher or better than another. and then acting the opposite. I've been hosting a podcast type of network and have noticed that people only want to have conversations with me when they're in need of a promotion or to launch something that they are selling. That's very disempowering. My question is, how do I find pure, true people who are coming from the heart and not the ego? I want to have powerful, inspiring, and uplifting conversations and raise vibration using social media and make real change in the content that we have on these platforms.
Yeah, I think that's a tough thing because, and I've also made similar observations in the years that I've done a show and done interviews and such. As an example, Micheila and I have said in previous shows that we couldn't do the same expo we did years ago, knowing what we know now. Because a lot of the people we have had at our expo, or even on Awaken Empowered TV in the previous decade, in light of things that happened in the last few years and how a lot of those people presented themselves online and otherwise, we wouldn't have them on our show or the expo in the future. So that's part of the reason why we're not doing an expo at this point is it's hard to choose individuals at this time who would be in alignment with who we are, that we would want to put them on a show. And so I think that's a challenge. Now, another thing also that became very evident the last few years is that, and of course the guides have talked about this in Channel Revelation shows as well, which is spirituality is not necessarily vibration or consciousness. And what you're describing is there are a lot of people in the world today who are quote unquote spiritual. They may go to yoga class and they may study meditation and have gurus and such, but everybody approaches what they do from their current level of consciousness. So somebody who goes to yoga class who may be in a third dimension, they may enjoy the yoga class and they may be following the exercises just like anybody else, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're having the same experience of that class as somebody who's fifth dimensional. And the same is true for anything. So what you have to understand is the spiritual community is very big. And even there are very big name celebrities in the spiritual community these days who are not doing very positive things for society. And yet most people would consider them to be spiritual. The number of people who are at a high consciousness level, by contrast, is a very, very small group, and you can't identify them by their preferences or by the fact that they may be in a spiritual modality or they may present themselves on a podcast in a quote-unquote spiritual way. Consciousness and spirituality are two different things, and identifying who is conscious and who is conscious and spiritual, perhaps, versus somebody who is spiritual but not conscious is a difficult thing to do, but it is something that you'll have to learn how to do. The other thing to consider is, as I've said in previous shows, Chiron is in Aries right now, and it's been in Aries since 2020, and it will remain in Aries until I think 2026. And so this is a period of time on the Earth when we see egos being very overblown, so even more so than usual, although this has always been a phenomena. But certainly during this time, people are very self-centered by contrast to normal. Everybody wants to be right. Everybody wants to be heard. Aries is also about identity, and that's why identity politics are such a big deal these days in society. This is why people feel that it's their responsibility to shout at each other their opinions on things when nobody asks their opinion necessarily. So you're at a time on the planet where people are very self-centered, and so it's going to be even more challenging to find a highly conscious, high vibrational individual to have on your show who is not going to present themselves in a more self-centered way, because a lot of people are very self-motivated right now. So there is no easy answer for your situation, but you have to if you are going to continue doing this show, you're going to have to get better at evaluating people based on their vibration and not on what they say on their shows or other interviews that they do. I always say, look at what a person does and not what they say, because anybody can say anything. And especially on social media these days, people present themselves in a positive light, but the reality is their behaviors don't always match with what they're saying. So if you can try to evaluate what people actually do in their lives, you will see that that's an easier way to understand. And just like the last few years, how a lot of people in the spiritual community showed up in the world the last few years of turbulence and propaganda and such, how they showed up shows their true intentions and motivations. And that, to me, tells me if I were to invite certain people on the show in the future, who would I invite? Not based on what they say on social media or in their videos that are very polished and positive, but in fact, how they really are underneath the surface. There are many people who even in previous years we wanted to have at our expo, very well-known people in the spiritual movement who I would never have back, never have, because we didn't have them in the first place, but I would never invite them in future shows. Doesn't matter how good an opportunity or how big an audience they have or how beneficial having that audience be interested in or finding out about us wouldn't be worth it, because now that I know, based on the actions of some of these individuals, that it wouldn't be in alignment. And it's a tough thing to evaluate in these days, because what it appears on the surface isn't always what it really is. So you're just going to have to get better at that, and I'm sure you can do it, and understand that until 2026, that ego-driven mindset of people is going to be more pronounced than normal.
Yeah, and we've got a depressionary period also that we're launching into. So I think in the spiritual community, we're already seeing it. The push for sales is just really becoming quite pronounced. And, from my perspective as someone who's in that community and who does sell things in addition to the things that I put out there for free, I think promotion really is not necessary when you're doing an interview at all. As a matter of fact, I've turned down more interviews over the last several years, and I used to do tons than I've ever done. And this is why. I think any show, podcast, telesummit, whatever it may be, is a collective consciousness. You're creating a collective consciousness based upon every guest and every contribution that comes to that show. So I know discerning individuals can be really tough, but I think more so you have to create the boundaries and the intentions and uphold them in very strong and sometimes uncomfortable ways with the individuals that are coming on your show. For example, no promotion whatsoever, and no mention of anything like that, and make your intentions very clear. Early on, really before we even launched the first expo in 2013, Ethann started interviewing people on the Awaken Empowered Expo channel. And we had written guidelines and intentions for that show because we really wanted to put out positive information that would be helpful for people, not sharing the muck and the dirt or anything promotional. And that was all in writing. And it went out to guests. And there were some guests who weren't happy about that. And I think that's how you weed them out. If you hold your standards extremely high, especially over the next several years when it's going to be really tough because people are going to be in difficult situations financially, we're going to be dealing with a lot of ego. It might be easier for you to create a platform and a show that is matching the vibration that you want. And it may need going back to the drawing board and really thinking through how that's going to be rebirthed or come about, because I think integrity is really everything. And if we've learned, personally, if I've learned anything over the last 3 years, it's brought me back time and time again to my authenticity. the work that I'm putting out into the world, it runs through the scrutiny and the filter of my ego every single day, because I do not want what you're stating here, because I see it so much going on in the world. And I truly believe that you don't have to sell when you're in these positions. When you truly find what you're here to do and what your mission is, if you put it out there freely with no expectation as a part of that open source model, you're certainly going to announce when you have things, special offers. You know, I do that all the time. I put out courses, I put out workshops. I want people who follow my work to know that the guides are going to bring us something really valuable that we can tap into, but it's all in the way that it's framed, right? It's not something that is driving my work. It's an accompaniment to a larger expression. So I think if you're looking for people who are out there with an open source model, meaning they're already putting out something very genuine and very authentic in the world that you know and you can feel is true, those are the type of people that you should pursue, not the ones who are inauthentically constantly asking for the interview at the most opportune time. Because throughout the many years that I've been doing this work, I've never pursued an interview ever from anyone, which might surprise people, because I've been fortunate to be invited on some really cool things. Ruben Langdon's, interview with E.T. and Kevin Moore. And I've, been blessed to have so many people pursue me for interviews, but not one of them had I ever pursued or asked to be on. They came to me because of the work and the expression of that work that I was putting out freely into the world. And I think that taking that position is really going to help you over the next several years.
I think that was interviews with Extra Dimensionals.
Extra Dimensionals, yes. Yeah. Ruben's interview with Extra Dimensionals, which was on Gaia for a period of time, right? I think, if you put the work out there in an authentic fashion, in a true fashion, as it comes to you, not forcing it by a schedule or by any type of sales goals, all the right things are naturally going to fall into place. It's really just kind of going back to what you talked about with the IRS. If you're going to lose money, if you're going to go to jail, it's already accounted for in your divine plan. So the higher and higher you step into that plan vibrationally, the more and more good things I think will happen.
You can use us as a model. We don't really push anything on these shows. We're just here to do what we're here to do. And I think, as I said in the earlier conversation, whatever is in your divine blueprint is going to play out. So there's no reason to try to force people to buy things from you. And getting into the various people in the world who are the billionaires and the world leaders, they're using some very nefarious means to achieve that level of wealth. For the rest of us, we are going to have whatever we need to have. And so if you go out there and you do something that's authentic to your soul's journey, and you have these classes or whatever other means for source to provide for you, those means will be used. Whether, let's say, you're teaching classes like Micheila does, well, people will sign up for those classes. You don't have to force it on people. If maybe you don't teach classes or you don't do anything else, the source will provide for you through some other means because you're following the path you came here to follow. So none of us needs to force money to come down our direction or to force people to buy from us or to sign up for our programs. That's a very lack-based mentality, a very fear-based mentality. And it doesn't work anyway, because what you're meant to have, you're going to have when you're meant to have it. With the exception of people in the world who use various Kabbalistic, not very benevolent methods to achieve the levels of extreme wealth that they have beyond what their needs are. Those are things that most people, and I would imagine most, if not all of you watching a show like this, would not want to participate in. So unless you're going to do that, you just need to trust it's a journey that you're meant here to have, is going to unfold on its own. You don't need to worry about anyone stealing from you, whether it be the government or whether it be someone else. You don't have to worry that you're not going to have enough, because what you're meant to have, you're going to have. Now, if you don't have right now, then that's also there by design. I have had moments earlier in my life where I had very little or nothing, financially speaking or materially speaking. And in hindsight, I can see why those times happened and the valuable experiences I gained from it. But at the time, going through it, it was not something that I wanted. So if that's your situation, then it's happening for a good reason and for something that your soul came here to experience at this time. So, I would say that, and also Micheila made mention of this depressionary period. In 2026, Chiron enters Taurus. So between here and there, we're going to see a shift from a more egocentric mindset in society to a more money-centric mindset, because when Chiron's in Taurus, we're going to be both feet inside a period of a Great Depression on the planet. And so a lot of people are going to become intensely focused on money and making money. And we're going to see that in this spiritual community as well. So again, spiritual does not mean consciousness. The consciousness-based community may not be as focused in the money aspect of it. Doesn't mean you can't make money, but the focus can never be that. Money is needed for the world in which we live today, but our focus should not be the money. Our focus should be the purpose that we came here to fulfill. And meanwhile, the money will come to us that we were meant to have at that time, because we're following that purpose. And the resources necessary to continue to fulfill on that purpose will continue to be provided for us as we need.
I think money can easily pull us out of our integrity. And that's something we really have to be aware of in spiritual movements. And, when we own a spiritual, quote unquote, business, if we put this in, business, third dimensional model, you are a brand, we are a brand. And something that Ethann and I have become very meticulous about and intentional about is who are we entangling our brand with, which is essentially an energy. It's a vibration. In a podcast or a telesummit, interview scenario, it's not just the host. It's everyone that the host brings on the show. So when you entangle your energy in something, I think you have to be very clear and very aligned and very intentional to be sure that it is a direct match to your own.
All right. Well, that's a good place to wrap it up for today. Thank you for joining us for another audience question session. And we seem to have temporarily, at least for now, solved the problem with advertisements showing up on our YouTube channel, but it may not be forever. So you may want to also check us out on other platforms like Rumble, or various podcast platforms like Apple or Spotify and various others. So we'll see you again next week for another Channel Revelations.